James Thornton, the billionaire CEO of Thornton Enterprises, had long become accustomed to the trappings of his success. His life was one of perfection. A string of tailored suits, meetings with powerful figures, lavish penthouses, and dinners that never ended. The world outside his glassy walls seemed far away, something that existed only in passing moments when his gaze briefly flickered from his high-rise office to the busy city streets below. But it wasn't always this way. There was once a time when James had seen things differently, when family mattered more than money, and love wasn't just a transaction. That time felt like a distant memory now, buried beneath years of chasing something that never truly satisfied him. His father, Paul Thornton, had raised him single-handedly after his mother passed away when James was just a boy. Despite being blind from a young age, Paul had always found a way to make sure James never felt less than the other kids. He'd been tough, unyielding, and fiercely protective of his son. Those early years had shaped James, and for a long time, he had admired his father's resilience. But now, years later, his admiration had been replaced by a quiet sense of guilt and neglect. James had moved to the city, grown into a man of power, and eventually disconnected from the very man who had shaped his life. Paul had never asked for much, just a little company now and then, a visit here or there. But James's business empire consumed him. His father had once told him, "James, don't forget what matters most. You can't buy happiness and you can't own time." Those words now felt like echoes in James's ears, fading with every day he neglected the bond they once shared. It had been 2 years since he last visited Paul. And though Paul's blindness had worsened, James had convinced himself that his father was well cared for. After all, Paul had his own routine, his cane, his independence. He was a fighter, a survivor, or so James thought. In truth, James hadn't wanted to face the reality of his father's decline. It was easier to imagine him as the strong man who didn't need help, even if it was a lie. Then came that rainy afternoon. James had just left a meeting that could determine the future of his company. His mind buzzed with numbers, projections, and the next big deal. As the rain came down in sheets, the city streets blurred in his peripheral vision. He adjusted the rearview mirror, thinking of a dinner reservation later that evening. But before he could make his way to the restaurant, something caught his eye. A shadow moving in the rain, crawling along the side of the road. The world outside the car slowed to a surreal pace. James squinted through the heavy downpour. Couldn't be. He hit the brakes hard, bringing his car to a screeching halt, nearly forgetting the rain-soaked streets that threatened to spin him out of control. He threw open the door, his sleek designer shoes splashing into the puddles as he raced toward the figure in the distance. As he approached, his breath caught in his throat. There, struggling along the street, was his father. Paul, once a strong, guiding force in his life, was crawling across the wet pavement. His frail hands dragged him forward, one agonizing inch at a time, as 3 small children, triplets, crawled along beside him, their tiny, soaked bodies clinging to him for warmth and safety. The sight was surreal. Paul had always been the one to take care of others, but here he was, drenched, broken, trying to crawl his way forward as he clung to these kids. James froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, the rain now a distant sound in his ears as he knelt beside his father. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling with shock. Paul turned his head toward his son, his face pale and weathered, but his expression softened with recognition. I couldn't get them to safety. The bus didn't come, and I couldn't leave them behind, James. They were lost. Alone." His voice was weak, strained, and in it, James heard something he hadn't in years. Exhaustion, fear, vulnerability. The triplets, shivering from the cold, clung to their grandfather as though he were their only lifeline. James looked at them, their faces streaked with tears, their little hands reaching for him as he knelt beside Paul. What happened, Dad?" James whispered, trying to make sense of it all. "I couldn't call for help," Paul murmured, a quiet regret in his voice. "I didn't want to trouble anyone. These kids. They needed me, so I just..." crawled. I just wanted to get them home. Tears welled in James's eyes. The reality of the situation was too overwhelming, too raw to grasp fully in that moment. His father, despite his blindness, his frailty, and the fact that he could barely walk, had taken it upon himself to care for these 3 children. And here was James with all his money, his power, and yet, he had not even noticed that his father had needed him. For the first time in years, James felt utterly helpless. James's mind raced, a whirlpool of guilt and confusion crashing within him. He had always thought of his father as a figure of strength, a man who had lived a hard life but had always seemed to carry on, no matter the odds. But now, kneeling in the rain, watching Paul struggle with the weight of his own frailty and the responsibility of these children, James realized how far removed he had become from the man who had raised him. The rain continued to pour down, drenching them both, but neither seemed to care about the cold anymore. James turned his gaze to the children, their little faces pale and red from the cold, their clothes clinging to their small frames. They were so young, and yet here they were, struggling alongside a blind, elderly man who had given them everything he could. "Who are they, Dad?" James asked softly, his voice cracking as he looked at the triplets. Paul sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion. "Their mother. She was my neighbor. A few months ago, she passed away from a sickness. I couldn't just leave them. They had no one else, James. No family to take care of them. They're my responsibility now." James's chest tightened at the words. His father had taken on the burden of these children, not out of obligation, but because he saw a need. And in that moment, James understood that it wasn't just about the triplets. It was about a man's deep, unshakable sense of duty, of love, and of giving everything he had left to those who needed it most. Without thinking, James stood up and pulled his father into his arms, his hands shaking as he helped Paul to his feet. The triplets, still unsure of what was happening, clung to his legs, seeking comfort in the stranger who had just appeared in their world. "We need to get you all inside, out of this rain," James said, his voice steadying. His mind was still processing everything, but his instincts were taking over. He couldn't leave his father out here any longer. "Not like this," Paul tried to protest, his voice weak. "James, I'm fine. The kids. They need you, not me." But James wasn't having any of it. "No, Dad. You've done more than enough. It's time I stepped up for once." With surprising gentleness, James helped Paul into the back seat of his car, making sure the triplets were safely buckled in beside him. The storm raged on, but for the first time in a long while, James didn't mind the cold. He wasn't thinking about the merger that could make or break his company, or the dinner reservations he had made. All that mattered in that moment was getting his father and the children to safety. As he drove, the car's headlights illuminated the wet streets, but James couldn't help but think about how much he had missed in the past few years. The world outside his car seemed so small compared to the one inside, a world that held family, responsibility, and a love that couldn't be measured by the size of a bank account. The car rolled up to his father's modest home, a small, 2-story house that seemed miles away from the penthouses James was accustomed to. The house was humble, unpretentious, but it was filled with memories. Paul had lived here for decades, and it was where James had grown up. Yet, in all those years, James had never truly appreciated the home for what it represented. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything his father had worked for, of everything he had sacrificed for his family. As the car came to a stop, James didn't wait for the triplets to unbuckle themselves. He rushed around to his father's side and carefully helped him out of the car. The triplets followed, their small feet splashing in the puddles as they hurried up to the porch. Inside, the warmth of the house greeted them, a stark contrast to the cold and rain outside. James helped Paul to the couch, making sure the triplets were settled in blankets. As he turned to leave to prepare something warm for them, his father's voice stopped him. "James," Paul said quietly, his voice cracking, "I never wanted you to feel burdened by me. I never wanted to be a weight around your neck. But I always hoped, one day, you'd realize that the things that matter most in life aren't the things you can buy. They're the people you love and who love you in return. James stopped in his tracks. His father's words pierced him like a dagger. There it was, the truth he had spent years ignoring. Paul had never asked for much, but what he needed most, what he had always needed, was for his son to truly see him, to be there when it mattered. Not just for the trips, the vacations, the big meetings, but for the simple moments that shaped a life. James swallowed hard, his throat tight as he turned back to his father. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have been here. I should have been better." Paul smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "You're here now, son. That's what matters." The weight of his father's words hung in the air, but for the first time in years, James felt a flicker of something deep inside him, something long buried. Love, regret, and maybe, just maybe, the hope that he could still make it right. As the hours passed, the storm raged on, but inside Paul's modest home, the warmth of the fire and the laughter of the triplets began to fill the air. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the house felt alive. James moved quietly around, heating up some soup he found in the pantry, gathering blankets for the children, and making sure his father was comfortable. The routine of care, the simple acts of kindness, made him feel something he hadn't in a long time needed. The triplets, despite their exhaustion, were full of energy. They had settled on the living room floor, huddled in blankets, sharing stories of their mother with each other. They were too young to understand the full weight of the world, too small to grasp the complexities of what had happened. But in their innocent voices, there was a sort of purity that James hadn't heard in years. They spoke of their mother's love, her laughter, how she would always tuck them into bed with a kiss, and how she had promised them that everything would be okay. James sat down across from them, watching their small faces light up as they spoke. He could feel the weight of their words, their loss, hanging in the air. They had been robbed of something precious. Their mother, their protector, and now they were clinging to the man who had taken them in, blind and frail though he was. "How are you feeling, Dad?" James asked, turning to Paul, who was sitting back on the couch with a tired but content smile. "Better," Paul replied, his voice soft. "You did well, James. You're a good man." James shook his head, his heart heavy with a combination of guilt and gratitude. "I don't feel like it. I should have been here sooner. I should have been the one looking after you. Not the other way around." Paul chuckled weakly, a sound full of wisdom that only age could bring. "It's never too late, son. You've come back when it mattered most. That's what counts." The words settled into James's chest, heavy and sincere. It had taken something as extreme as this rainy day, this unexpected turn of events, to snap him out of his carefully constructed bubble. But now, sitting in this modest home, surrounded by the echoes of a family struggling but still holding on, he realized the stark truth. The world he had built wasn't the world that mattered. It was a shell, a facade designed to impress others, but it was hollow. And in that hollow, there was nothing that could replace the warmth of family, of genuine connection, of love. As the evening wore on, James found himself speaking with the triplets. They were shy at first, but soon, they opened up, sharing their favorite stories and asking him about his life. They didn't know who he was beyond being their grandfather's son, a distant figure who had never been part of their world. But as they spoke, James listened, really listened, for the first time in years. The rain outside had turned into a gentle drizzle, and the clouds began to part, letting the last remnants of the storm scatter across the horizon. Through the window, James could see the faint light of the setting sun breaking through the clouds, casting a soft, golden glow over the neighborhood. It was a beautiful sight, one he would have missed if he hadn't been here. The triplets were starting to drift off to sleep, their little bodies curled up on the couch. Paul had long since dozed off beside them, his breathing slow and steady. James sat quietly in the chair across the room, watching them all, feeling a mix of emotions flood over him. He had come here expecting to do a good deed, expecting to fix what was broken. But what he found was that in trying to help others, he had stumbled upon something even more precious: his own heart. He had spent so many years buried in his work, in the illusion of success, that he had forgotten how to feel, how to connect, how to truly love. His father had given him everything: his time, his wisdom, his sacrifices. And now, in this quiet house, in this small, intimate moment, James realized how much he had taken for granted. He stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the wet streets below. The city felt so far away now, as if it belonged to someone else. It wasn't his world anymore. Not the world of corporate deals and late nights in high-rise offices. This world, this was where he belonged. Here with his father, with these children, with real life and the things that truly mattered. James let out a breath, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The days that followed felt like a slow awakening for James. He had never imagined that something as simple as spending time in his father's home could bring so much clarity. In the days after the storm, the triplets settled into their new routines, and though they were still young and confused by the world around them, there was an undeniable shift in their lives. They had found a sense of security in Paul, and now, with James there, the foundation they had built together seemed stronger. James took a week off from work. It was a strange, almost foreign feeling to step away from the constant barrage of emails, meetings, and numbers that typically consumed his life. But he had made a decision. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about the family he still had left, the connections that were worth more than all the wealth he could ever accumulate. He would stay. He would help. Each day, James helped Paul around the house, taking care of small tasks Paul had long since struggled with. He fixed things that had been broken for years, cleared away clutter, and reorganized rooms that had grown dusty with neglect. The triplets, now more comfortable with James, had taken a liking to him. They followed him around the house, asking questions and showing him their drawings, which they proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Each drawing was a small masterpiece in their eyes, a reflection of their innocence and their need to be loved. But as the days passed, James began to see something troubling. His father's health had worsened since that rainy night. Though he had rallied in the beginning, Paul's body was showing signs of age in ways James hadn't anticipated. His hands trembled more often, his breathing became labored at times, and he seemed more exhausted than ever. One morning, after a particularly long night of staying up with the triplets, Paul collapsed on the couch, his breath shallow and ragged. James immediately called for an ambulance, panic rising in his chest. His father had always been strong, too strong sometimes, for his own good. But now, seeing him like this, vulnerable and frail, James realized just how much time he had wasted. At the hospital, the doctor informed him that Paul's health had deteriorated significantly. The blindness, which had once been his father's greatest challenge, was now compounded by heart issues and the toll of years of independence without support. Paul had been pushing himself too hard for too long, trying to keep up with responsibilities that were too great for him to bear alone. James sat with his father in the hospital room, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his mind spinning with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have been here. I should have seen this coming." Paul, lying on the bed with an IV in his arm, reached out and touched James's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're here now, son," he said, his voice soft but steady. "That's what matters." James stared at his father, overwhelmed by a sense of regret. How could he have let this happen? How could he have been so consumed with his own life that he missed the quiet suffering of the one person who had always been there for him? Over the next few days, James spent every moment at the hospital by his father's side, helping him through tests, talking to doctors, and making decisions he had never imagined he would have to make. But with every passing moment, he realized just how much of his father's strength he had taken for granted. And in that realization, he also discovered a new sense of purpose. In the evenings, after visiting hours, James would return home to Paul's house, where the triplets were waiting. They had no idea what was going on with their grandfather. They only knew that he wasn't feeling well, but they sensed the change in James. The way he spoke more softly now, the way he seemed to appreciate the small things, the way he looked at them like they were the most important people in the world. One evening, After another long day at the hospital, James returned to find the triplets playing with their toys in the living room. As soon as they saw him, they rushed over, their small hands tugging at his shirt. "Mr. James, look what we made!" One of the triplets, a little girl named Lily, said excitedly, holding up a drawing of their family. Paul sitting in his favorite chair, the triplets around him, and James standing behind them, smiling. James smiled, a warm, genuine smile that felt like it had been too long since he had worn it. "That's beautiful, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You all are amazing artists." Lily beamed, proud of her creation. "You're in the picture too," she said, pointing at the little figure she had drawn standing behind them all. "You're our family now." James knelt down beside her, his heart full. The weight of the world seemed to melt away in that moment. The triplets had no idea how much they had given him. They had brought him back to the things that really mattered, to the simple, beautiful moments that had once been lost in the rush of his life. He glanced over at Paul, who had managed to come home from the hospital for a short period of time, resting in his favorite chair in the corner of the room. His father's health had not improved, but the doctor had given him a little more time, a little more strength. James walked over and sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here. I'm not leaving again." Paul smiled, his face a little more at peace. "I know, son. I know." As the days passed, James kept his promise. He stayed at Paul's side, helping with his father's care, supporting the triplets, and slowly building the kind of family life he had long neglected. Each morning, he would wake up early to prepare breakfast for everyone, trying his best to make the house feel like a home, rather than a place of sadness and illness. He made sure the triplets got to school, helped them with their homework, and even found time to sit down with them, playing games and listening to their innocent dreams and stories. The triplets quickly grew attached to him. Their laughter, once hesitant and cautious, became a constant soundtrack to James's days. They didn't care about the business world or the wealth he had amassed. To them, James was simply someone who cared, someone who showed up when it mattered most. But Paul's health continued to decline. Though he had rallied briefly after his hospital stay, his body was frail, and the strain of caring for the triplets had taken a toll on him. He grew weaker, his steps slower, and his hands shakier. It was clear that his time was growing short, and James could see it in his eyes. The man who had always been full of life, who had once walked miles just to prove his independence, was slowly fading away. One evening, as James sat by Paul's bedside, his father turned to him with a tired but calm expression. "James," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I'm proud of you." James blinked, the lump in his throat thickening. "Dad, please don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. We're all going to be fine." Paul shook his head gently, his eyes locking with James's. "No, son. I'm proud of you because you've finally come back. You've finally realized that there's more to life than money and power. You're here now. That's all that matters." The words struck James like a tidal wave. He had spent his life running from the very things his father had taught him. But now, here he was on the cusp of losing the one person who had always seen him for who he truly was. His father's faith in him was something James had almost forgotten existed. "I'm not leaving, Dad," James said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Paul smiled faintly, his eyes softening with a love that James could hardly comprehend. "You don't need to stay because you feel sorry for me. Stay because you love them." He motioned toward the triplets, who were quietly playing in the next room, unaware of the conversation. "They need you, James. They need someone who will teach them how to live fully, not just survive." James swallowed hard, a weight settling on his chest. "I'll be here, promise." That night, as he lay in bed, the stillness of the house enveloping him, James couldn't shake the feeling of time slipping away. His father's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of everything he had neglected for so long. The family, the love, the bonds that were stronger than any business deal or high-profile merger. He had spent so many years consumed by his own ambition, by the need to prove something to the world, But in that moment, he realized that the only thing that truly mattered was love. The love between a father and a son, between a grandfather and his grandchildren, between family members who stood by each other no matter what. In the morning, as the sun rose and the light crept through the curtains, James made a decision. He would not return to his corporate life. He would stay here in this house with Paul and the triplets. He would care for them, love them, and build a life around what truly mattered. He would leave the world of business behind and start anew, not for the money, but for the people who needed him most. As he walked downstairs, he found Paul sitting in his favorite chair, his face pale but peaceful. The triplets were playing nearby, their laughter filling the room. James knew his father didn't have much time left, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace he had never known. It wasn't the peace that came from business deals or financial success. It was the peace that came from knowing he had made the right choice, the choice to be present, to love, and to finally live the life that mattered. The triplets looked up at him, their faces lighting up with smiles. "Mr. James, come play with us?" one of them called, holding up a toy car. James smiled and walked over to them, sitting down on the floor beside them. As they pulled him into their world of imagination and play, he felt a warmth inside him that he had never experienced before. This was what it was all about. Not the suits, the meetings, or the endless pursuit of wealth. It was the simple moments, the quiet love, and the bonds that could never be broken. As the weeks passed, life in the Thornton household slowly returned to a quiet routine, one that was vastly different from the chaos of James's previous life. He had let go of the demanding world of business, the mergers, the high-stakes negotiations, the constant rush to accumulate more. Instead, he found himself waking up early each morning to help Paul with his medicine, making sure the triplets were fed and ready for school, and spending the afternoons with them, reading stories, playing games, or simply sitting by the fire, talking about things that mattered. Though Paul's health continued to worsen, his spirit remained strong. He would sit by the window in his favorite chair, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and smile as James and the triplets played in the yard. There were days when he seemed so weak, his body betraying him. But there were also days when he was full of life, his stories and laughter filling the house as though he were still the strong, independent man he had always been. James had come to appreciate the quiet moments, the small gestures of love and kindness that once seemed insignificant. He didn't need a fortune to feel fulfilled anymore. What mattered now was the family he had been blind to for so long. But despite the peace that had settled over the house, there were moments when James couldn't escape the harsh reality of what was happening. His father's condition was deteriorating. The doctors had been clear. Paul didn't have much time left. His heart, weakened by years of self-reliance and hardship, was giving out. One afternoon, as James sat with Paul in the living room, watching the triplets play outside, his father turned to him with a serious expression on his face. "James," Paul said, his voice soft but firm, "I want to talk to you about something." James, who had grown so accustomed to the sound of his father's voice, turned toward him. "What is it, Dad?" Paul took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. "I know my time is running out, son, and I need you to promise me something." James's heart sank at the words. He had known this day would come, but hearing it from his father made it all the more real. "Anything, Dad. Just tell me what you need." Paul looked at him with a steady gaze, as though weighing his next words carefully. "Take care of them, the triplets. Don't let them grow up like I did, struggling to find their way in a world that doesn't always care. They need love, they need stability. They need someone to teach them how to live, not just survive." James nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking deep into his chest. He had already made the decision to stay, but hearing his father speak those words made him realize just how important his promise was. The triplets were still so young, so full of potential, and they needed someone to guide them through the challenges they would inevitably face. "I'll take care of them, Dad. I swear it," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Paul smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "I know you will, son. I've seen the change in you. I'm not worried about that." James felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his father, the man who had given him everything, who had shown him what real strength looked like. I just wish I'd realized this sooner. I wish I hadn't wasted so much time. Paul reached out, his hand trembling as it rested on James's. Don't regret the past, James. It's done. What matters now is what you do with the future. Don't waste another minute. Love them. Be there for them. That's all I ever wanted for you. James sat in silence, his heart heavy but full. He had spent so many years focused on himself, on his ambitions, on the pursuit of wealth. But now, as he sat beside his father, he realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was family. What mattered was love. The days that followed were a blur. Despite the heaviness in his chest, James tried to keep life as normal as possible for the triplets. He took them to the park, helped them with their school projects, and spent quiet evenings watching movies together. But the shadow of his father's illness loomed over everything. He could see the toll it was taking on Paul's body, the way his once vibrant spirit was slowly being consumed by the frailty of age. The man who had always been his rock was slipping away, and James felt helpless. Still, he remained committed. He knew what his father had asked of him. He had to be there for the triplets, for the little ones who had already lost so much. The promise he had made wasn't just about caring for them in the present. It was about securing their future. He had to be their protector, their guide, the one who showed them that there was more to life than just surviving. The triplets, for their part, seemed unaware of the gravity of the situation. They could feel the change in the air, the quiet sadness that often filled the house, but they didn't fully understand. They were just children, after all, and James wasn't sure if he should tell them the truth. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the man they had come to love was about to leave them? How do you prepare them for a loss so great that words could never fill the void? One evening, as James sat by the fireplace, watching the triplets play, his father called him over. Paul was sitting in his chair by the window, his frail body barely able to hold itself up, but his eyes were still sharp, still filled with the same wisdom that had guided James through so many years. "James," Paul said softly, his voice weak but steady. "I'm ready." James's heart skipped a beat. "Dad, please don't talk like that. We're doing everything we can to help you. You don't have to go through this alone." Paul shook his head gently, his gaze turning toward the triplets as they ran through the house. "I'm not afraid, son. I've lived a full life. What matters now is that you're here, that you've finally come home." James swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know how to do this without you, Dad. I don't know how to raise them, how to be the man you always wanted me to be." Paul smiled faintly, his eyes softening with a mixture of pride and understanding. "You've always had it in you, James. You just needed to find your way. Now you're the man they need. You're the man I always knew you could be." The words struck James deeply. His father's faith in him, despite all the years he had wasted, was something he would never forget. Paul had always believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. And now, in his final days, Paul was giving him the greatest gift of all, the confidence to move forward, to take on the responsibilities that would shape the future of the family. "I'll make you proud, Dad," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make sure they know how much you loved them." Paul nodded, his eyes fluttering shut as he rested back in his chair. James stayed by his side, watching the triplets play in the other room. He knew that his father wouldn't have much time left, but he also knew that Paul had given him everything he needed to carry on. He wasn't alone anymore. He had the triplets, and he had his father's memory to guide him. That night, as James lay in bed, the weight of it all finally settled in. He thought about the life he had once lived, the endless pursuit of wealth, the coldness of his high-rise offices, the shallow relationships that had come and gone. And then he thought about the life he was building now, one that was full of warmth, of love, of real connections. He had found his purpose, not in the world of business, but in the family that needed him. He had learned what it meant to truly live, to love, and to be loved in return. The night after his conversation with Paul, James could barely sleep. His mind was racing, thoughts swirling like a storm in his head. But despite the turmoil, one thing was crystal clear. His father's time was running out. He could feel it deep in his bones. There was a finality in the air, a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. He had to prepare, not just for the inevitable, but for the life he was about to lead without the man who had always been there, guiding him. The next morning, James woke early, as he had every day since he arrived. The house was still, the triplets still asleep, and Paul was in his chair by the window. His breathing was shallow, and he seemed to be sleeping, but James could tell that it wouldn't be long now. He walked over to his father, sitting quietly beside him. "Dad," James whispered, placing his hand on Paul's frail one. "I'll take care of them, promise." Paul's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled weakly, his hand tightening around James's. "I know, son, I know." The moment felt surreal. Everything seemed to slow, as if time had decided to stand still, allowing them both to savor these final moments. For the first time, James realized just how much his father had shaped him, how much he had given him without ever asking for anything in return. And now, as Paul was slipping away, James was the one who had to take up the mantle, to carry forward everything his father had taught him. As the morning wore on, the triplets awoke, their bright faces filled with innocence and joy. They ran into the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. Paul smiled, watching them play, his eyes filled with love and contentment. He looked at James, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint but proud smile. Later that afternoon, James sat by Paul's side, holding his hand as the final hours passed. The triplets were playing quietly in the next room, their innocent laughter filling the house with a bittersweet sound. James knew that this would be the last time he would hear his father's voice, the last time he would feel the strength of his hand in his. Paul's breathing grew slower, more labored. And then, finally, with a soft sigh, Paul Thornton, the man who had given everything for his family, slipped away. His hand, still warm in James's, fell limp, and the room seemed to grow quieter with each passing second. James sat there for a long while, unable to move, unable to speak. It felt as if the world had come to a halt, and all that remained was the weight of the loss. His father, the man who had shaped him, who had taught him the most important lessons in life, was gone. But even in his grief, James knew what he had to do. His promise had been clear. He would care for the triplets. He would give them the love, the guidance, the stability they needed to grow into strong, confident individuals. He would raise them in a home full of love, not just survival. And he would honor his father's memory by becoming the man Paul had always known he could be. In the days that followed, James made arrangements for the funeral, and the entire town turned out to say goodbye to Paul. He had been loved and respected by everyone who knew him, and the people who had watched him raise his son knew that his legacy would live on through James and the triplets. As the ceremony came to an end and the last of the mourners left, James stood by the graveside, looking down at the fresh earth. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered into the wind. "I promise." The days turned into weeks, and James settled into a new rhythm. He spent more time with the triplets, helping them with school, playing with them, and making sure they knew just how much they were loved. He didn't need to be a billionaire anymore. He didn't need the luxuries or the status. What mattered was family. What mattered was love. And as James watched the triplets grow, he realized something he had never truly understood until now. Happiness wasn't something you could buy. It was something you built with the people who mattered most. It was the laughter of children, the quiet moments shared with loved ones, the simple joys that made life worth living. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden light over the house, James sat on the porch with the triplets. They were drawing pictures of their family, their tiny fingers smudging the crayons as they created their masterpiece. James smiled, looking down at the children who had become his world. He had come full circle, from a man lost in the pursuit of wealth to a man who had found the true meaning of life. In the distance, the wind whispered through the trees, and James knew, deep in his heart, that his father was still with him, not in the form of a man sitting beside him, but in the legacy of love, sacrifice, and guidance that Paul had left behind. It was a legacy James would carry forward, not just for himself, but for the triplets, and for the family that had finally come together in a way that mattered most.